All right. Thank you to everyone joining us today and our panelists. I'm going to introduce you guys in a few seconds here, but wanted to welcome everybody joining the live stream. We're streaming in a number of different places, including in the Launchpad community in Newark, New Jersey. So welcome to everyone who's joining us today. As many of you know, in November, New Jersey residents approved public question number 1, essentially deeming recreational cannabis legal for adults 21 years and older, coming up very soon, beginning January 1st. So we're fortunate today to have a great group of industry experts to help us discuss with the Launchpad community this new legislation and explore how New Jersey can ensure people of color, those with marijuana offenses prior to legalization, can be afforded an opportunity to participate meaningfully in what will surely be a booming industry for the state. So let me welcome in our panelists here. We are pleased to have joining today Almez Adegbola, a cannabis chef specializing in neo-soul food pop-ups and baked goods since 2015. Her company, Brown Box Kitchen, gained so much notoriety that she officially opened Brown Box, a CBD store in Orange, New Jersey, with her partner, Ty Griffith, in late 2019. I'm going to add Ted to the stream here. Welcome, Ted. I'm introducing our panel here.
Hey, Chris,
our panel as well as Ted Chung,
co-founder of with my connection. I'm going to enter back in.
You want to come back in? Okay. I'll get to Ted when he comes back. Also on our panel is Louis Koski, COO of Metric, the leading solution for cannabis governance. Before joining Metric in 2019, Louis ran his own consulting firm where he helped government agencies develop cannabis policies. And prior to that, he served as the director of the Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division, helping to build the first U.S. state agency to develop and implement medical and adult use cannabis regulations. And we'll introduce Ted when he comes back in, but let me welcome the two of you first. Almaz, since you are our New Jersey panelist and already sort of in the industry, why don't I give you the floor first and sort of give us a sense of what this means for you as an entrepreneur in this emerging industry, and where you think this is headed for New Jersey.
Well, for me as an entrepreneur, I think it's a big opportunity. I tried to, our company Brown Box tried to position itself ahead of time so that we would be able to have some type of headway with the legalization that's happening. A big part of New Jersey, what New Jersey requires for applicants is experience. So one of the reasons why we opened the CBD store was to kind of get that experience going in the cannabis business, and hopefully with the micro licenses be able to kind of seamlessly transition into selling recreational cannabis. For New Jersey, I think it's an awesome opportunity. You'll see more people moving here. You'll see more tourism, which I think is great for the state. I think for a long time, we've been kind of like, running right behind New York with a lot of different things. And I think this finally gives us an opportunity to kind of step ahead in the industry.
That's great. And let me introduce Ted, and I want to come back to one of the comments you made. Ted, welcome. Ted is the co-founder of Mary Jane, the mainstream cannabis media platform, and notably the brain trust behind the Emmy Award-winning show Martha and Snoop's Potluck Dinner Party on VH1. Ted is also the co-founder of Casa Verde Capital, a leading cannabis VC firm and a longtime business partner in content technology and cannabis ventures with Snoop Dogg. Welcome, Ted.
And longtime friend to Chris Schultz. How are you?
That's right. Well, I was actually going to tell a little bit of that story. One of our, not our first meeting, but one of our meetings where we were sort of hanging out, and understanding your motivation, it helped sort of formulate the goal of this panel, because you've been in the cannabis industry for a long time, and this was several years ago before the wave of legalization was sweeping across the country. And you said one of the most important things to you on a very personal level in terms of what you're hoping to accomplish in the industry is make sure that the industry is inclusive of people of color, of people who have been in the industry prior to it being legal, and so they were operating illegally, and making sure that doesn't necessarily exclude them from participating in this industry. Long story short, you're hopeful that the cannabis industry, like many high growth startup industries, isn't just Stanford MBA grads that benefit from it, but it's inclusive and equitable for the communities across the country.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think that when we were probably talking about that, even if it was, 7 years ago, right? That why it was, I thought, important to get ahead of the 8 ball is because there is an opportunity with the runway to federal legalization, with kind of the fragmented nature of territorial ownership, that really should allow for greater adoption of inclusivity and diversity, and entrepreneurs that are looking for a window in, because at the very least at that time, the starting line was sort of the same for entrepreneurs on the ground and private equity, right? Everyone had different entry points, but I think that there was more of a level set, open field for all of us to run through and figure out kind of where the opportunity was.
And Louis, I want to bring you in here. Obviously, this is a highly regulated industry. I'd like you to share with us a little bit about metric and the track and trace and sort of involvement in the industry. But because you've been involved in states as they've gone through this legalization process, I'm interested in you bringing in sort of your experience. New Jersey is not necessarily reinventing the wheel with the mission of sort of an equitable industry. So I'm curious what you've seen work, what maybe you've seen that hasn't worked as well, because this is sort of a blue sky, but coming very fast for New Jersey. So would like you to bring in sort of that perspective that you have.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. It's great to be on the panel with all of you. You mentioned earlier my background. So I come from a law enforcement background, regulator by trade, and was involved with Colorado back in the early days of legalization for Colorado as the director of the Marijuana Enforcement Division. And at the time, I think our perspective was a little different than what Ted was describing 7 years ago, in that we were really focused on, as an early adopting state, kind of making sure that the illicit market that existed wasn't participating in the industry, right? So that was kind of our focus at the time, and I don't think back then we understood as well as we do now how important it is to have regulations that create opportunities for different sizes of businesses, and that you can do that and still have a robust regulated framework. And I think now, looking back and at what's happened, those early adopting states served the purpose of really creating a strong baseline by which other agencies and states can move forward, and it's given the opportunity to really start to focus on creating opportunities and reducing the barriers to entry, so that minority communities and lower income participants can get into the marketplace. And so what we have seen is every state has adopted basically like two tiers of public policy. You've got the broader public policy that is addressing these really important issues like social justice, restorative justice, possession limits. There's also public health and safety issues like working through the challenges with DUID and those kinds of things. And then you've got what I kind of refer to as the regulatory policy. And the regulatory policy is that bit that's going to be monitoring the licensees, making sure that they're in compliance with all the regulations. And what we've found is that it's important to have social justice, social equity, inclusiveness incorporated all across the boards, from that broader policy all the way down to the regulatory policy as well. And I think a couple ways that we've seen that happen is reducing the barriers to entry by addressing criminal convictions and not making them a bar to entry, creating equity application processes. And then there's kind of like the lesser known, kind of like maybe indirect in so much as that states have adopted public policy related to efficiency of reporting and efficiency of reporting compliance. And that's kind of where our company comes in, and that we kind of create a low-cost bridge for small businesses to be able to operate in a comprehensively regulated marketplace, while at the same time have efficient ways to be able to report to the regulator that they can demonstrate compliant activities. So to be able to really create that inclusive atmosphere, you have to make sure that there's inclusivity at all tiers of the public policy.
Right. And I'm curious, I want to go back to, as you mentioned something that I want to bring out and make sure our audience hears. There is a component of the legislation that allows for what are called micro licenses. So my understanding is these are licenses for companies with 10 employees or less. It sounds like that would be, how you will establish your license. But can you talk a little bit more about this? Because I think that a natural point of entry, and I want to move on to other parts of the industry, but then a natural point of entry will be, running a dispensary, right? And that's what those micro licenses are for.
So there will be definitely, as you're saying, the micro licenses for businesses that are operating 10 or fewer. And we want to make sure that that's just going off of the legislation that possibly will be voted on. I think that the legislation is still being worked on, but I think it'll be a great opportunity because it will be a lot more inexpensive to gain entry into the industry. Whereas right now, just to open a medical dispensary in New Jersey, they want to see at least $1 million or more in capital to do so. So I think that a lot of people should look at the micro licenses, and they should also look at, if you don't want to open a dispensary, if you don't even want to touch the flower, there's going to be a lot of other licenses that are going to be available, like consumption licenses. There's also going to be special transportation licenses. So as you know, you can't transfer cannabis across state lines. So if you can get one of those transportation licenses, your company will be able to transport cannabis. And there'll also be delivery services, a lot of different ways that you can get into the industry without opening a dispensary. And I feel like that's so important, and people should really understand that opening a dispensary is not the only way to have your hands in the industry.
What do you think that the most is sort of the most interesting path? Having $1 million of capital, right, is
none of us have it really. for at least for people of color, especially.
Right. Yeah. If you don't have a capital backer, so what do you think? Do the micro licenses require that you do have the $1 million, or is the micro licenses?
And that's the thing. I don't know I won't speak off the top of my head. I'm not sure how much they will be, but just looking at what other states have already done, I'm sure that they'll be a lot less inexpensive. Also, because we'll also be offering grow licenses in New Jersey, I believe that will give businesses the opportunity to open a dispensary without also having to open some of the other things that you need for the facility, such as a grow facility right now and things of that nature. Because right now in New Jersey, we don't even have grow farms. So all the dispensaries that are operating, as far as I know, they're growing their own flower as well. So I think that these smaller licenses will help to give people opportunity to be in different parts of the industry and not have to take on, because really that $1 million I feel is to open, you know, to have the front end and back end, to have the grow facility, to run the dispensary, to have all the regulation, as Lewis was saying. So I believe that once they break down each license, we'll know exactly what we need to do for them, and it'll probably be a lot less expensive, like 10 grand, 15 grand, of that nature.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Ted, in your experience, and sort of along the lines of your sort of personal objective, with helping entrepreneurs and people of color in this industry, what have you seen sort of work? You and I are in California. You've been involved in other states, I'm sure, as an entry point for entrepreneurs, and you work with a wide spectrum of entrepreneurs. I'm sure you work with sort of smaller scale small businesses up to you also make VC investments. But what have you seen that you think would be interesting for entrepreneurs in New Jersey to consider in terms of a point of entry into the cannabis industry?
I think that that what I like about an opportunity, if I was in the position of Almas, for example, would be the benefit of what Lewis went through in Colorado, what I've experienced in a few of the states here and in Canada, and to look at California as and how that sort of vertical chain has really evolved in many ways, right? And where is the real value proposition at the end of the day? I think comparing how the regulation and the requirements and social equity programs that exist in New Jersey, take a look at what's happening in Michigan, take a look at what's happening in Illinois, take a look at what's happening in California, and compare and contrast, know what's been set forth before, and how can you leverage that knowledge as to like where the entry point is in New Jersey. So, for example, we've all talked about it in the space, but there were a lot of players out of necessity. And it's interesting to hear what you said on this about like dispensaries have to be backed by their own grows and cultivation sites because of all the other outstanding factors. And you get this immediate surge of like, I need to do this piece of the chain, this piece of the chain, this piece of the chain, and this piece of the chain. And that's where I think lessons were learned, right? It was out of, and so what happens there is that, there is a reasonably intense CapEx required to fulfill and control that entire stack. Is that sustainable is something that I would highly encourage people in New Jersey, entrepreneurs of all sorts, to take a look at the anecdote and the case study in California and see if that will pan out that way, right? And where can you spend time owning a piece of that chain, much like Lewis and Metric, to say like, this is where we reside and this is our domain of authority. Now that may not mean, $100,000 a month in sales out of a retail storefront, but really, what's the long-term goal of that? Is that you want to open a store? I mean, there are other things and other products you could probably open stores around and retail storefronts that that would be potentially more profitable, right? And maybe more of an end game. I think there's a lot of excitement whenever this happens in a state. And I think the question is, okay, where's the real value proposition at, right? So one of the things that I look at when I look at the history of what's happened across the country and these other territories internationally is, and I know that, Chris, that I'm a staunch believer in this as far as, on the front end side, not on the back end necessarily, is brands. I think brands are about to be the brands and then the infrastructure components, right? I'm talking about back end. I'm talking about metric. I'm talking about, these spaces, technology and brands are going to be the sustainable and opportunity sectors for young entrepreneurs. And I think that when it's just history repeating itself, when everyone's rushing to go create the vertical stack. And I'm not saying you're not gonna see some winners. And if you have got a lot of capital resource, there is a game to play there. But I think that creating and owning a brand that speaks very clearly to a specific audience is going to be quite valuable over the next 2 years.
And Ted, that's interesting because the brand, creating a meaningful brand, while there's a lot of areas of expanding a brand that require extensive amounts of capital. The sort of the original idea and brand essence is really, it's about connecting with an audience. It's about connecting with consumers. So it doesn't actually require that much capital initially. But brand growth does. How have you seen sort of acquisitions? I mean, I could see some early stage entrepreneurs creating some very interesting brands. Newark, where we are, has a deep culture, an authentic culture. You could see Almez or others, creating a very interesting brands that would end up, being acquired or maybe invested in for growth. What's the trajectory once you're able to establish a brand like that?
Well, I'm sorry, was that for me?
Yeah, Ted, and then we can sort of roundtable on the panel. I'm curious just in response to your question.
I think there's a lot of interesting case study to look out there, because I would, again, and I say this to all the young entrepreneurs, and I wish someone had told me this earlier in life, right? Is to whenever you pursue whatever piece of the puzzle you're trying to occupy, and when I say a brand, I want to be clear. I could be talking about a brand that has products, but that brand, once you have the community, could also be a brand that's applicable to branding a storefront that someone else has a license for, right? So it's all about, I'm just talking about making sure you have a brand that captures a captive community and a captive consumer, right? I think that there's quite a few anecdotes around, and especially if you look in Canada, the way that the market is going to inevitably have excitement, fervor, appetite for acquisition as things, as more states come on board and as impending federal legalization occurs, that if you have some sort of momentum and the right narrative, that, and I say the next 2-3 years, there will be particularly sized companies that are going to be looking at how they can prepare to enter and ensure they have regional authority over the consumer. And the only way, or I should say the fastest way they can do that, is by purchasing brands that have a loyal audience.
Right. So that proverbial sort of green rush, the federal legalization is an important gating issue for some of the larger players, like, let's say, consumer brands, Coke and Pepsi, I don't know, Morris, Kraft, others. Who knows? They may be placing bets now, but they'll sort of enter soon. And particularly on federal regulation. We got some questions coming in from the audience that I'm going to put up. But Ted, I heard I don't know if it was a prediction or just sort of a notion. I'm curious if other panelists, federal legalization. Did you say 2 or 3 years? Do you think it's coming?
Do I think it's coming in 2 to 3 years?
Yeah. Or do you have a timeline, a prediction, any thoughts?
I guess I'd just say, I think all of us are on this call because we all know in our gut it's going to happen, right? I think, 2 to 3 years is probably a hopeful scenario. But there's so many elements that even a crystal ball couldn't tell you exactly how this is going to play out, right? I think what everyone needs to keep in mind is that this is the time to build brands, build assets, build technology. Take your piece and stake now. If you are an entrepreneur from any background, you should look at taking advantage of this moment, because this level of arbitrage, and in some ironic way, Chris, the longer it takes is the longer runway we have as state by state comes on board to kind of accelerate our value propositions, if that makes sense, right? Because once you have big alcohol or big tobacco or large institutional capital come in, I saw it happen in Canada in front of my eyes. It's just it changes the area of arbitrage, and I would recommend for an entrepreneur or for anyone who happens to be watching, take a look at a company called Tokyo Smoke, and that was acquired by Canopy, and kind of, I think there's a lot of learnings there.
Interesting. Tokyo Smoke. We'll Ariel, maybe you can grab the website and we'll put that on the screen for people. I want to direct the next question. This is coming from the audience watching. First to Louis and then Almez. I'm curious because I think you'll have two different perspectives on it. We've got a question here that are what are the barriers to entry in the industry? And Louis, I'm curious about your perspective, and I know regulatory environment, this is a highly regulated industry. What's a starting point in terms of barriers to entry into this industry in New Jersey?
Yeah, so a lot of them, there's a lot of just natural barriers to entry getting into the industry. For one, especially kind of in the spot where New Jersey is now, you're looking at on-ramping an adult use marketplace, early next year throughout 2022, and so the public policy around this is going to continue to be really dynamic. A lot of times the licensing processes themselves can take a while to work through. I know in that initial round of applications that we had in Colorado when I was still working for government, took about 3 or 4 years off of my life trying to get through that just the big, huge onslaught of applications that were coming in. And so that can create some barriers to entry. I think Almaz's point earlier too, just about the cost, especially if you're in a vertically integrated market, and if that's a requirement, that creates a real significant barrier to entry. And so, one thing that we do is we encourage people to look at, and I think this is kind of to Ted and Almaz's point earlier about looking at all of the potential opportunities that are out there in a marketplace, and trying to find that area that kind of matches your aptitudes along with the opportunity that exists, whether that's within a licensed business. But we mentioned a couple of times how Metric kind of lives on the outskirts of the licensee entities, and we work typically just for government, but we're one of those ancillary businesses. And our key to success in the marketplace has been focusing on seed to sale tracking and doing it very well. And so as you're looking at all these opportunities that we've been talking about, the ones that are both on the licensee side, but also all of the opportunities that are out there for ancillary businesses to do some really good work to support the industry. Because even though we're down the road quite a bit and there's been a lot of best practices established in the absence of federal legalization, what we know is that there's still a lot of big service companies that are still not participating. And so it creates opportunities for small businesses to provide accounting and legal services. There's companies that form that do trimming operations. There's just a countless number of opportunities out there for small businesses to be included in the industry that may have some benefits of less regulatory scrutiny in some cases, and a lot less startup capital to get off the ground.
Interesting. Almaz, what about from your perspective? What do you see as barriers to entry? This might just be for yourself. I know it was interesting to hear experience. You mentioned that key factor, and that's why you've started the CBD dispensary to gain experience in the industry. What are some other barriers to entry that you see from your perspective?
I would say a big one, we've touched on it a little bit, but social justice. There are a lot of people who, just coming from my community and what I see for particularly people of color is any pre-existing offenses, making sure that New Jersey, I'm hopeful that they will have some type of inclusivity for those who may have like nonviolent offenses previously. And they hopefully may also look at it as experience, because a lot of these people do have a lot of experience already in the industry that could help bring it forward. You know what I mean? So just that social justice aspect is a big barrier to entry. And I think that overall, it's me going into the CBD and also doing cannabis food. I think that overall, the biggest thing is we keep touching on ancillary businesses. Just don't my biggest advice is just not to look at the usual suspects, as Ted said, and as Lewis said, it's really about looking at all the different ways that you can provide, because, it may seem like a great thing. I opened a dispensary and everything like that, but being someone who's in the industry and having even a CBD dispensary, there are a lot of services that I wish were out there specifically for us. Even, for example,
what are some of those, just to give an audience some ideas? What would be helpful for you?
Well, a big one, for example, is I wish that there were more credit card processors to even let people process cannabis, because it's illegal right now on the federal level. A lot of banks still don't recognize marijuana businesses as legitimate businesses. So there are a lot of loopholes that people have to go through to open up their business. And then even when they open it, they might have to be cash only in a time of a pandemic and COVID where, marijuana may be essential business, but people are having a hard time getting it. You know what I mean? So there's one company, Square, that we use, and it works great. They have a CBD early access program. And I wish a lot of other companies and startup companies looked at that market, the big financial market of accepting cannabis payments, because if they can make it happen, they would make a lot of money, and you don't even have to touch the flower or anything.
Ted, any recommendations? Are you aware of any companies that you can process credit card transactions through right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's there are many answers into that, right? Part of it again is how you set up your business. That can afford you flexibility as to how you position, what your core business is and how it operates. Again, not just I could go into this for hours, but again, that's why I'm a strong believer in brands, right? If that makes sense. And from a banking standpoint, it continues to be an issue for small businesses. In California, you've seen credit unions take on a lot of the financial transaction availability, but that ends up becoming they can only take on so much, And so it does leave the small businesses with, options like Square, depending on what type of products you're carrying, and still a lot of cash getting moved around, right? So something we definitely have to solve for, but I would highly recommend anyone getting into the space to carefully and discuss any cannabis attorney worth their weight would be able to advise on maybe some structural ways that would allow you to enter into other credit card programs.
I want to go to a question here from the audience, and I think I missed a question earlier. We'll come back to that. But what are some of the tech aspects to the cannabis industry? If you're a startup, maybe you're a startup at Launchpad in New Jersey, are there opportunities that you see, from a tech perspective in cannabis right now? I'll throw that out. Anybody who wants to jump in on that has some ideas.
Sure, I'll jump in there. I think I mentioned earlier that there still tends to be a deficit of services for licensed businesses. We've seen a number of tech companies. I mean, Metric is a SaaS company that's been really successful in this space, but there's been a number of other businesses like point of sale companies. We've seen companies that are focused on like ERP or inventory management controls that are more of kind of like the business management side rather than the regulatory compliance side of things. And many of those businesses have become multi-state operators. We know this because there's over, I think last time we counted, there were about 1,200 different companies that had integrated into Metric in the various states that we currently operate in, which is 15 states and DC, to kind of put that into perspective. So I think tech continues to be in demand. I think especially when you can help to solve for some of the outstanding problems, whether it's helping to solve for some of the lack of financial services, helping with identifying compliance and risk to businesses. There continues to be opportunities in some of those areas that I think are still pretty wide open, and especially in a new market like New Jersey, where it's going to be expanding into adult use.
All right, I'm curious, Almaz. You touched on a point that I thought was interesting, and I'm going to put up a quote here from Governor Murphy. This was you were talking about aspects of the industry like transportation and delivery. This is related to tourism. New Jersey really is part of obviously a metro region adjacent to New York and Manhattan. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that marijuana will be legal for purchase by anyone 21 years or older. You don't necessarily have to be a state resident. I'm curious, Almaz, if you see interesting opportunities from a tourism perspective. Ted, I don't know if you have any experience, but Las Vegas is, Nevada is another, state. Lewis in Colorado, with legalization a few years ago, that I know yielded a lot of tourism. But starting with you, Almaz, what do you see just in your sort of crystal ball for the connectivity between New Jersey and sort of the regions around from a tourism perspective? From your perspective?
I mean, I believe that there's going to be a lot of tourism. If not tourism, just a lot of people coming simply to purchase marijuana from surrounding states. And I just see that from, because of surrounding states that have legalized, such as Massachusetts, which is only 3 hours away, and DC. I know a lot of people that go back and forth to purchase their marijuana. So I think that the same thing is going to happen for New Jersey. And as there are business opportunities and financial opportunities, you will always see an influx of people moving here. And I feel that New Jersey has already been preparing for that, just because our housing, even though it's super expensive, is still a little cheaper than it is to live in New York. So just because of that gentrifying aspect already, people have already been moving here. And, you know, anybody that can just open their eyes and see, can see that once a lot more dispensaries start opening up, a lot more businesses, people will have to move here for whatever reason surrounding cannabis. And I think that it can only make the state greater. I think that it was a very good opportunity for us to legalize, because even though we have a little bit of tourism, as I said early in the conversation, New Jersey has always been just a little bit behind New York in some way. You know, just culturally, New Jersey is a smaller state. It's a little slower than New York. So I think that it just gives us, you know, a great opportunity for people while they're here to not only see that it's a beautiful state as well.
And there are some opportunities. I think these are sort of regulations that are being defined now. I don't know if they are, so I don't want to speak out of turn, and anybody can correct me. But there are some consumption, some like on-premise consumption possibilities that may result as a part of this as well. You mentioned transportation, so just from that entrepreneurial aspect. There are going to be other areas of opportunity.
Yes, definitely. I do believe that, like I said, the legislation is not completely set as far as I know yet. They're still just trying to work out a couple kinks, but I do believe that it was written for consumption licenses, which means that you would be able to consume the product within a certain square footage, and you would be able to open a space where people can essentially smoke weed inside. And I think that alone will create tourism. You know, it'll be hopefully kind of like a nice place that you can go. And we already see it in California. And we even see California playing with the idea of places where you can not only consume but also eat, and that's another big just cannabis cuisine in general. I think that it would be very crucial for New Jersey to be ahead of that as well, because it would just bring a whole nother dimension to the licenses already.
Interesting. Ted, Lewis, other aspects, from or predictions or words of caution. Governor Murphy obviously is anticipating tourism. He's also, I think, anytime an economic opportunity, you want the tourism, but you also want people to move there and live there. Where do you guys see that going with New Jersey as from a regional perspective?
Well, I think that that it's interesting because maybe we could speak towards Lewis and I's common experience in Colorado, but again, just taking notes from what I thought was really interesting was in the beginning of Colorado's transition to adult usage. I think I read an article that said that the year after that. There was like a double the increase in growth in pizza delivery locations and sales. And I think that's just an indicator of how, for New Jersey's, the sort of ancillary effect of legalization can, whether that was from more tourists or whether that was from residents of the state, there are additional benefits to surrounding businesses that aren't in the cannabis industry. A lot of them, local entrepreneurs, and there's a way for local entrepreneurs to take advantage of that and adopting perhaps a marketing relationship with dispensaries because I saw that happen a lot in the early days, where people can help point business to each other, right?
Mhm.
And all of that sort of community of commerce is really important. The other thing that I saw in the early days of Colorado, I don't know if you recall this, Lewis, is how there would be these tour buses from Texas and all the colleges in Texas.
Hmm.
And essentially they would round up a bunch of, college students that were of age, bring them across to Colorado and have like a fun tour where you get to stop at a dispensary and then you might see, stop at a particular area of interest for tourists in Colorado, have a great meal, and then go back, right? So that in itself you don't need a license for that business, right? I mean, you might need a bus driver's license or something, but it doesn't require a cannabis related license. So there's a lot of opportunities around the space as it relates to tourism. And we all know that, given how the shape of Atlantic City as sort of a spotlight has been, like there is a need for revitalization. And, I don't think this could come at a better time.
Yeah, Chris, Almaz was right on the money. Tourism is going to be material, and Ted's also right in so much as that there's going to be ancillary businesses that form around that concept. And I mean, to kind of maybe just throw a few numbers at it. Colorado, which Ted was talking about, they figured that 9% of total consumption in the state of Colorado is attributable to tourism. I think that's the most recent report that came out. An interesting thing, though, about what's happening right now with respect to tourism is it's down across the states, and it's down in really big numbers. We were looking at this just this week, noticing that some states are reporting reductions of as much as like 65 or 75% of destination type tourism coming into the state is down largely because of, not exclusively because of COVID-19. So I think like in the next 6 months to a year, well, tourism's certainly going to bounce back and it's going to be material. There could be some disruptions in terms of how that actually kind of gets momentum again. I don't know that we're ever going to see a day where someone comes up and who's official enough and that we believe enough that says it's all clear, it's safe to go on vacation again. And because that's probably not going to happen, the amount of tourism that is impacting the total amount of sales in a given state is going to be really determined on how long it takes for us to get really cleanly to the other side of COVID-19, which means we're down to zero new cases across the country and maybe even internationally before people start to feel comfortable traveling again.
Got it. Okay. All right. I've got a quick hit question. I'm curious that I'm going to put up from the audience, and then I do have one kind of wrap up question that'll bring back to sort of the equity in cannabis that we're sort of here to discuss. But this is, I'm just curious from an audience member, from our consumer standpoint, what does happen to price of cannabis when it is legalized? From a obviously pre-legalization of black market economy to a regulated economy, what tends to happen to price in these markets?
My experience is it goes down, right? Because you have more participants in the marketplace. They're producing more supply, and the price tends to go down, and that's something that everybody needs to keep in mind. Again, I always tend to think of it from the government action side of things, and of course, if you're counting on prices to stay high as a government official, and you're planning your tax off that, if prices really start to go low, the amount of revenue you expected to get goes down with it. But short answer is my experience is that it goes down and then kind of stabilizes and then starts creeping back up over time.
Interesting. Okay, and then that probably covers that. That makes sense, from an economics perspective, with more supply and legal supply in the market. So I'd like each of your reaction.
Can I add something to that?
Sure, Ted. Yeah, go ahead.
because I think what Louis said, I just don't want anyone to miss that, because the people of New Jersey have this power in their hands to talk to their representatives and ideally protect the cannabis businesses and entrepreneurs and startups from this. See, this is about the illegal market pricing versus the legal market pricing in many ways, right? And so in California, our issue is that because it's not completely flushed out, nor I think thought through, and maybe that's because, and maybe time will correct that, right? And the data that's been collected, but it's an issue when you get to municipal level taxing, to state taxing across every piece of the sales chain. Mm-hmm. And the end product ends up, because to your point, the government's trying to collect as much taxes as possible. That's why the people in every municipality have some amount of influence here too. Then that just affects the end consumer. And if pricing goes up on the store because people need to retain margins as business owners, then you'll see a lot of fluctuation back into the illegal market because pricing has gone up per pound so much, right? So right. It's actually started to create an environment where it's hard for some businesses to survive without feeding into that illegal market out the back door, right? So I think we have to be very conscious and learn from history and make sure that New Jersey protects its business owners and allows them to operate as unencumbered by unnecessary high taxes and taxes all along the chain, because then everyone loses.
And that disparity with the taxation leads, like you said, back into a gray market or a market. And Akeem, sort of added to his comment here. He the comment about margins and inventory. You don't want to depress. Margins are key to any business, and as the price goes down, it does have margin compression. Okay, I want to come back to on this topic. Come back to sort of the social equity discussion here. I'm going to put up a comment by Governor Murphy. Actually, this isn't a comment. This is just the fact of the legislation. 70% of the sales tax revenue, as well as the grower tax, will be committed to aiding communities and individuals disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. It's not on the screen, but these programs include mentoring, legal aid, and healthcare. What are 70% of the tax being committed? Different states have done this differently. It's gone into education. It's funded, budget deficits. This is a big commitment by the state of New Jersey, going in a direction that really is about equity and in this industry. So, what are some of the things from your standpoint you would recommend or like to see the state direct these into? Louis and Ted, and then Almaz, I'm going to give you the final word on this.
I think I don't know that I can speak to the 70% and whether or not that's the right number or not, but I think the methodology could be really effective, because if I'm interpreting that correctly, it's transferring taxes that are collected to the neighborhoods that need it the most. And I don't, and a lot of times I think when we're talking about cannabis and social equity, we're oftentimes talking about ensuring that there's opportunities for minority communities to participate within the industry, which is correct, right? We should be thinking about that, but there's also some opportunities to also help those communities in broader ways. So it's not maybe safe to assume that participation in the cannabis industry is the only place that we can help with minorities communities participation. There might be other things that could be used to help economic development within those neighborhoods outside of cannabis itself. So cannabis could, in of itself, be a way of helping to improve the lives of people that live in some of the poorer neighborhoods.
And in Colorado, you can give me the answer to where most of the tax has been directed, but what has been the result of sort of the tax revenue in Colorado?
So I think there's a portion of the excise tax that goes to a school reconstruction fund. It's not actually to education, but what we've seen over time is the amount of money that is, first of all, it's increasing every year, and so they're continuing to build and bring in more programs that can help with a number of different programs that can help with whether it's drug rehabilitation or education, housing. There's been a number of different things that they've been able to do to help those in need in Colorado.
Great, Ted, your reaction to this direction of the tax revenue?
Well, I think the headline and the quote is sounds good, but I think the question is, where is that money going, right? Mm-hmm. And does leadership really have a handle on where it's been most effective? For me, I think that as an industry is being created, why not actually translate that into job training for the industry, right? Like, I'm a product of going from the mailroom into the corporate suite. Like, that's another path to provide, economic wealth, is get people in the industry, right? I've always thought there'd be real value in, just like there's job training programs for other business sectors, like start these programs in the communities that need them, in underrepresented communities and communities of color, so that whether it's from cultivation to distribution to retail, people have an entry point in and an accreditation, right? I think that would be a valuable use of funds. Otherwise, I can't comment on what programs these are funding, and I don't know if they're to the benefit of the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Almez, what's your reaction and your hope in terms of the sales tax revenue and maybe more broadly about the industry?
Just to follow up to what Ted was saying, it always sounds good in the beginning when the government promises that certain revenue would go towards the industry. I definitely think that the greatest way that we can help is, as Ted was saying, getting into the actual industry. I think that is the most important thing. The most valuable thing is information. And what I often see a lot of times is that, they may give inclusivity, right? They may give us, a certain portion to applicants, to people of color applicants. They may, make it a little easier, but are they going to train and teach people how to fill out these applications and to actually start these businesses? And even teaching, like Ted was saying, any type of job training that could be given is the most important thing, because that is the only, I believe that experience is really the greatest teacher. And if not the job training, then making sure that there are, if they're going to give expungements and social justice aspects like that, that make sure people know how to actually follow up with it and actually be able to have lawyers or public defenders available to carry out these expungements and, to help with some of those barriers that will, hurt people in the end when it comes time to actually apply. Like right now, it's like a very gray area about what is going to be, what's not going to be, what's going to be available. So, we don't want to be running around trying to figure it out while other people already have the information and they're well on their way to starting their business.
Right. Okay. Well, we've had the hour has flown by. I want to thank each of you, Louis, Ted, Almez, for joining us today. Thanks to everybody tuning in at Launchpad and beyond. And This is an exciting time in New Jersey. It's coming at us fast. January 1st will be legalization. Wish you each the best of the luck, and hope to connect again soon. And thanks so much for joining us today, folks.